Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for turning out on a horrible cold night. I'm John Elvidge, Chair of the David Hume Institute, for people who don't already know me, and it's not me that you normally see standing up here doing this, but as many of you will know, Jane Frances Kelly, who's been so successful as our director for the past 2 and a bit years, has been lured back to Australia, where her career had been before she came back to Scotland, and left us a week or so ago. So you've got me as a substitute. So this evening we're extremely lucky to have Jonathan Portes with us to speak about immigration policy. You are, I hope, all aware that quite recently we published a report on the labour market in general in Scotland and the challenges facing that. And in that report, we flagged up the significance of immigration as a constituent part of that set of issues. Contrary to the impression you might have got from some of the media coverage, we did not say in the report that changing immigration policy was a silver bullet that would resolve all of the labour market issues, but we did say that it was difficult to conceive of a set of solutions which did not have immigration policy as one of the crucial moving parts. So there could I think be no more directly relevant follow through on the report than the territory that Jonathan is kind enough to cover for us this evening. And if you needed an extra bit of contextual relevance, some of you may have spotted that the Scottish Government's expert advisory group on migration and the population published a report in the last week or so, which reinforced a number of the messages around this, and reinforced the significant part that migration has played, not just in Scotland in recent years, but in a whole range of OECD countries that are part of a broadly similar spectrum of challenges. So, as well as it being a pleasure to have Jonathan with us, it feels very much of the moment to be examining these issues. Jonathan had an illustrious career in the government economic service and was chief economist both at the Department of Work and Pensions and at the Cabinet Office. So has seen the issues from the heart of government and from the bit of government that spends most money on the consequences of things that happen in the population. And Jonathan is now a senior fellow at the Economic and Social Research Council's UK in a Changing Europe initiative based in King's College, London. So absolutely has his finger on the pulse of this set of issues. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction, John. I should start actually. So it's not normally that I have to say that introduction is a bit dodgy, but I actually you'll remember this, John, from the Cabinet Office, because we are of course now in what we are. I'm sorry, I'm going to use what is now the unpolitically correct word of purdah. We are now in election purdah. And what that means, according to the SRC, is that people like me who are funded by the SRC, as you said, aren't allowed to say so if we're going to say anything that reflects on politics or policy. And as you can imagine, giving the title, I am actually going to say quite a lot on politics or policy. So hopefully the SRC don't have their spies here and won't haul us over the haul me over the coals for this particular abuse. But for the avoidance of doubt, obviously, what I will say about politics and policy are my views and mine alone, and not those of the SRC or notionally of the UK in a changing Europe. It's also perhaps, as Dawn Collingly mentioned, some of my later jobs, but actually my work on immigration dates back to, as we were discussing before, to the first time I met John, which was in the Cabinet Office in about 1999, when I was working in what was then called the Performance and Innovation Unit, subsequently the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, and I wrote a paper called the Migration and Economic and Social Analysis, which I think was the first attempt to try and examine the impact of immigration on UK economics and society in a broader sense, and to use that to try and frame immigration as an economic challenge and opportunity. And that paper was quite influential in the subsequent policies of the Blair government. And I've retained an interest in it both from a policy and a research perspective in the 20 years since. And I see you have this here, which is my attempt to synthesize that in a relatively short and readable fashion, at least. That's published by Sage, an attempt to sum up what it is that we, broadly, it's got a bit of history, a bit of politics, and a fair amount of economic analysis, but broadly trying to explain what it is that we know about the impacts of immigration, particularly the immigration, say, of the last half century or so, both from within the EU, but also from outside the EU, on UK economy, society, public finances, public services, and the rest of it. And I say that because that's actually not what I'm going to talk about tonight, primarily. I am happy to talk about it, and I'm happy to answer questions on topics relating to the impact of immigration on unemployment or wages, or the fiscal contribution of migrants and so on. But I'm actually going to try and be, as John said, of the moment, and focus primarily on actually policy, and to take that as relatively given and read, and to focus very much on the politics and policy going forward. Where do we stand now in UK immigration policy? What are the policy choices that confront us? What are the possible scenarios? And what challenges in particular, and potentially opportunities, and I think there is an opportunity here, might that offer up for Scotland? So just a bit of where we are now after the Brexit referendum. What has changed? So we had relatively stable levels of immigration in the immediate in the years going up to about 2010-11. Then we had a quite significant dip in non-European migration, driven both by the recession and its aftermath, and by policies introduced by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary to reduce non-EU migration. At the same time as we saw a very large increase in EU migration here, driven in part by a sort of displacement effect resulting from the reduction in non-EU migration, leaving holes in the labour market which were filled by EU migrants, but then also the accession of Bulgaria and Romania to the EU in 2007, 7 years after, when their the restrictions on the transitional restrictions on Bulgarians and Romanians working in the UK were lifted, that led to a very large rise in EU migration, which peaked, as it happens, more or less a week before the referendum in the published statistics. But what's particularly interesting is that since then, of course, we have seen a really very precipitous drop in European migration. And indeed, the other evidence we have suggests that this, if anything, understates and lags behind what actually has been happening. In other words, the drop in European migration has probably been even sharper than is shown in this chart. And that's, of course, quite interesting because we haven't left the EU, as you will all know, and even when we do, free movement will continue during a transition period. So nothing has changed, and in the immediate future, probably nothing will change in terms of immigration law or immigration policy as regards people from elsewhere in the EU. But nonetheless, the number coming here has dropped very, very sharply. And that reflects a number of factors, not just Brexit, it should be said. It does reflect partly other broader economic developments. It reflects the fall in the pound, which is an indirect, and hence the indirectly Brexit, but not an immigration-related effect of Brexit. But it also does clearly reflect a sense that the UK is a less welcoming and less open country for people coming from elsewhere in Europe than was previously the case. But I think at the same time, non-EU migration has risen again. These numbers are probably wrong, by the way. They're probably significantly overstated. But nonetheless, the trend is probably also broadly correct. And there does seem to have been some uptick in non-EU migration, which is probably the flip side of this, that as it has become less attractive for Europeans to come here and fewer of them come, that has left gaps in the labour market which are now being filled again by non-Europeans. And this is, I think, one of an interesting illustration of the way in which of the unforeseen and unintended consequences of immigration policy that are not always immediately identified by politicians or indeed by civil servants when they are devising the policies. So, given that, where do we stand? Where do we stand for what is the future of UK immigration policy after Brexit? And here I am going to assume, for the sake of argument and discussion at least, that Brexit does indeed happen broadly on the lines suggested in the current draft of the withdrawal agreement, the Johnson proposals that were agreed a month or so ago. Of course, that's contingent on a number of things, but that seems to be the most likely single outcome. And I think that the important thing here is that there are a lot of moving and very complicated parts. The withdrawal agreement, although Johnson did renegotiate Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, this part of the withdrawal agreement didn't actually change. The part that relates to Europeans who are currently resident here. That's about 3.5 million, probably. We don't actually know the true number. There is, of course, no registration system in this country. This is a guess based on survey estimates. It may be somewhat more. We won't know until they are actually registered. But those people will have the right to register and stay, and the registration process is already underway. Equally, there are perhaps 1 million, and again, the numbers are approximate at best, Brits who are living elsewhere in the EU. Again, they will have the right to register and stay. Will they keep all the rights that they currently have? The answer is yes, but they'll keep most of them, and most of the important ones. But there will be an erosion in rights, status, and security for Europeans living here and for Brits living abroad. Perhaps worse, actually, for the latter than the former, for various reasons that I can discuss if anyone wants to. But there will be greater insecurity, and people will face a number of complications. And in some sense, that is simply an inevitable consequence of Brexit. So that's the legacy of EU membership. What about going forward? Well, the Migration Advisory Committee in September of 2018 made recommendations for a post-Brexit immigration system. What would happen when free movement ends? And I guess I should say that this will happen under the current withdrawal agreement. This will happen, that is, free movement will end at the end of the transition period. The transition period will end no earlier than December 2020, and indeed, in recent days, the Prime Minister has promised that it will not extend beyond December 2020. I think virtually every trade and European law and European expert I know thinks that that is no more credible than some of Mr. Johnson's other promises, and that we should assume that the transition period will end up being extended until 2021 or 2022. On the other hand, the politics of that also look quite difficult. So I think at this point we genuinely do not know. I don't think anyone genuinely knows. I don't think the Prime Minister actually genuinely knows what he will do when it comes to the crunch. But at some point in the next, perhaps as soon as January 2021, we will need a new immigration system. Now, on the basis of the Migration Advisory Committee report in September, the Immigration White Paper in December 2018 set out the government's proposals, and I'll say what they are in a moment. But that has been somewhat cut across by what the Prime Minister has said, which is that the UK will introduce a, quote, Australian-style points-based system. And he has asked the Migration Advisory Committee to look further at the evidence for such a system. So what currently then is the status of the white paper proposals, which it remains a white paper, it remains out to consultation. The Home Office is doing various bits of work around it. On the other hand, the Prime Minister has said that he wants something quite different, or something that at least sounds quite different, although whether it is quite different, we simply don't know yet. So there is quite a lot is up in the air in the broader political context. But so let me say first where we what was actually in the white paper. So the white paper set out a future skills-based system for UK immigration policy. And under this system, free movement would end as an automatic consequence of leaving the EU with no agreement that it should continue. And essentially, we would replicate the current system for non-Europeans. That is what I still tend to think of as the work permit system. It's technically called the Tier 2 system, which means that you can get a visa to come here for work purposes if you have a job offer and that job meets certain criteria around either salary, skills, qualifications, or occupation. And the Migration Advisory Committee, the white paper also set out that that system would be simplified considerably, and that the main way of deciding would be the salary threshold. And their basic recommendation was that you could come here to do a job that paid over £30,000, and except for certain limited categories and occupations, you would not be able to come here if you were being offered a job of less than £30,000. They also proposed removing the cap on the number of Tier 2 visas, which Theresa May had introduced in 2012, and simplifying the scheme in various other ways, which may or may not, depending on how the Home Office implements it, make it easier to come here and practice. They were pretty clear, the white paper was pretty clear that this would be the most of the system. There would not be, except for agricultural work, there would not be schemes for sectors like the health sector or the financial sector or the creative sector, despite clamor from all of those individual sectors that they wanted more. But there was a gesture towards the view of employers who employ relatively lower paid workers by suggesting that we would introduce a new scheme of temporary low-skilled work visas for people coming here to work in lower paid or lower skilled jobs. These visas would be limited to a year, and you'd have to leave when your time was up. I think it is absolutely clear from the vagueness and the questions that the description of the scheme in the white paper raised that this was something that was really inserted at the last moment as a gesture to some groups of employers, rather than something that had been properly thought out either by ministers or officials. So it is quite unclear what in practice will happen with that particular scheme. What about now? One thing, obviously, that relying primarily on a salary threshold does is that it has very different impacts on parts of the country that have different salary levels. And that, of course, is particularly obvious in the case of London and the Southeast, where average salaries are in many categories are 30,000 or over, compared to most of the rest of the UK, including Scotland, where that by and large is not the case. The MAC did consider, and the white paper endorsed this view, the case for regional and geographical differentiation of the salary threshold. And here you can see what they said. And basically, the answer was, as it had been in previous Migration Advisory Committee reports, the answer was that, well, we've heard what you say, Scotland, about wanting particular lower thresholds or differentiation, and except in certain very limited aspects around the edges, we're not inclined to do anything of the sort. And I think that there is this is not new. They've said this before, and I think what I would say is that this reflects a sort of conjunction of views between the Migration Advisory Committee, which in its first incarnation was chaired by Sir David Metcalfe, who had previously chaired the Low Pay Commission setting the national minimum wage, and David basically imported the same view of immigration that he had on the minimum wage, which was that you couldn't have geographical variation, it had to be the same nationally. So a confluence of that view from the Migration Advisory Committee with, frankly, the view of Home Office officials that which is true on immigration as is on a number of other policies, that they simply didn't want anybody else interfering in their policies, and they have no intention whatsoever of allowing Scotland more than the most minimal discretion. I think, and I'll say, I'm going to talk about the why, that may now be in the process of changing. But it is worth looking at the quite sharp differences here between, in particular, London and the Southeast. So this shows looks at current levels of European migration and shows what proportion would be excluded under these new rules if you did what was suggested by the white paper. That is, you had a qualification threshold of RQF3, that's basically A levels or above, and a 30,000 salary threshold. As you can see, about 30% of current EU migrants to London would qualify under this new threshold. So that's still a reduction of 2/3. But in Scotland, it would be only a little bit over 15%. In other words, there'd be there'd be almost twice as many proportionally coming to London as to Scotland. But it's also worth noting that actually Scotland is not particularly exceptional here compared to many other English regions. In fact, it does a little bit better than most of the relatively poor regions. And I think, I haven't done myself any work directly for the Scottish government on migration, but I have done quite a lot of work for the Welsh government analysing the impact of these new proposals. And the thing that really tends to emerge is that it is quite difficult on economic grounds alone to make a case for Scotland being treated differently. It is, however, quite possible to make a case on economic grounds for Scotland, Wales, and a number of English regions being treated differently from London and the southeast. And I think that's a key point in talking about what a regionally or nationally differentiated system of immigration might look like, is that this is not just about Scotland. It's also about Wales. It's also about the north, about the northwest and Yorkshire. And that is also true, as well as being true in labour market terms. That is also true in demographic terms. So this is a chart from the advisory group that John mentioned on the Scotland demographics, and as you can see, that's the no migration scenario. This is the current migration scenario, and you have various intermediate scenarios. Migration does have a quite significant impact on the demographics of Scotland, and again, this is not something that is unique to Scotland. Wales's demographics are in many respects just as bad, possibly actually even worse, because quite a few people tend to go there to retire, worsening the support, the demographic support ratio. So the economic and demographic case for more migration is one that Scotland can make, but it's quite a difficult one for Scotland, I think, to make on its own, as opposed to in conjunction both with Wales and possibly with other parts of the UK. But as I've said, those proposals, as outlined in the white paper, were proposals that were brought forward by under the Theresa May government, and Boris Johnson has said that actually he's not that keen on them, and that what he wants is a points-based, an Australian-style points-based system. So, what does a points-based system mean, and how might it work? I think the first thing to say is that in itself, saying that you want a points-based system is an almost entirely vacuous statement. And in fact, the current system, when it was introduced by the then Immigration Minister Liam Byrne in 2008, was actually described as an Australian-style point-based system for people coming from outside the EU. That never really caught on, which is why Boris Johnson can say that he wants one too. But if you think about it, if you're not going to have free movement, if you are going to have a system neither of completely open borders nor of completely closed borders, and I think under any conceivable possible scenario we are going to have neither open nor closed borders, then you need to have a set of criteria that says, at least for economic purposes, the following types of people may come here, and the other people who don't meet those criteria cannot come here as economic migrants. That is axiomatic. And once you have a set of criteria, you can call that a points-based system if you like. So it is perfectly plausible to say, well, we will have a points-based system, but it will actually look something very, very much like the system that was proposed in the white paper. And my impression is that that is indeed since that is the line of least resistance and the thing that is most comfortable, that is the line that Home Office officials are currently pursuing. On the other hand, if by Australian-style points-based system you mean something that looks a bit more like what they actually have in Australia or Canada or New Zealand, then you are indeed talking about quite a different animal. Because Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, all of which have things which you could plausibly describe as points-based systems, have both different mechanisms and different objectives. The first thing I think to say is that they also start from very different demographic traditions. They're basically much emptier countries that have had population growth for a long time, intend to continue having population growth, and see immigration as part of the motor behind population growth and hence economic growth. And that's not really something that's not really the way we think about immigration in the UK in general. We may think about it as being important from economic and labour market perspective. We don't in general, except perhaps in Scotland, think about it purely as a way of growing the population. But the second thing in terms of the system is that those countries have what I would describe as a more human capital focused system. We have an employer-led system. You need a job offer. And basically, whether or not you're allowed to come here as a skilled migrant depends on whether you have a job offer, and if so, what that job is, and what are the characteristics of that job in terms of salary and occupation. A more human capital focused system says, forget about whether or not you have a job, or at least relegate it somewhat in the list of important criteria, and say, well, what about you as a person? Do you have a particular set of skills? Are you qualified to a particular educational level, either in general or some particular subjects? How old are you? Are you younger and hence perhaps more likely to make a contribution over a longer period of time? Those are what we tend to call human capital type characteristics, and that is quite a different approach. In practice, none of those countries has a pure human capital system. The Australian and Canadian systems, or New Zealand systems, are all sort of have a mixture of employer-led and human capital. But we, and quite a few other countries, most European countries, when it comes to non-European migrants, have a more or less entirely, the Dutch are perhaps one exception, have a more or less entirely employer-focused system. So that's a big difference. And then the third difference, I think, is that it is much easier conceptually to allow a geographical preference or geographical focus in a points-based system, as indeed they do in Australia or Canada, than it is in a work permit system. That doesn't mean it's impossible to do it in a work permit system. It is possible to do it in a work permit system, but it sort of seems to make conceptually more sense. So, given that, what can we say about the potential impact? If we do take the points-based system rhetoric seriously, if not entirely literally, what might that mean for Scotland? And here's something that I have borrowed from. This is not my work; it is the work of Christina Boswell, who many of you will probably have heard of, who's professor here at Edinburgh, and her colleagues Sarah Kiambe and Smelly, and this is part of the work that some of the earlier work that they did for the Scottish government, which tried to rate the different characteristics of different systems as to how that they met the needs of Scotland. And I think the key thing to note here is that essentially they looked at the points-based system, a human capital-based system, which they also describe it as in their work, an employer-led system, a system that was based around shortage occupations, which is a little bit of what the MAC does now, but which they're planning to move away from under the new regime, and also the post-study work visa, which the UK government has now said that it will, in practice, reintroduce. And it sort of ranks them all the same, but I think it's notable that the reason that they rank points-based system only roughly equal to the others as opposed to ahead, is lack of political viability. So to the extent that that has changed, the points-based system now scores considerably higher on perhaps the most key element of a system, was whether it actually meets the needs of Scotland. And I think that's again, that should be reasonably intuitive. If Scotland has more characteristics that are in some respects more in common with, say, Canada and Australia than, say, London and the southeast, and I think it's pretty obvious that there are a number of characteristics in which it does have more. It is much closer to those countries, both in its in its political and economic objectives for immigration, but also in terms of things like simply in terms of geography and space. So I think that there are. I think that therefore that the Johnson, to the extent that the Johnson is serious about the points-based system, that opens up some quite significant opportunities for Scotland. And so Priti Patel did actually brief to the Daily Mail a couple of weeks ago that she was looking seriously at the option of having geographical preferences in a new system. And I think that's the first time that any Home Secretary has said anything of the sort in the 20 years that I've been working on immigration policy. She probably got quite a lot of pushback from people on both sides of the immigration debate. But I think the indications are that the UK government is potentially open to having a particular a regime which gives that opportunity to Scotland and perhaps Wales and elsewhere in a way which wasn't in the past. And I think the political economy of where we are makes this, and I'm going to end on an optimistic note. Brexit has, in all sorts of respects, been a complete and utter disaster for the UK. And I'm not talking about whether Brexit was a good thing or a bad thing, but the Brexit process of the last 3 years has been, I think, fairly self-evidently bad for the UK economy, bad for British politics, both in big P and small p political terms, bad for the quality of public debate and all the rest of that. But there's one big exception to that, in my view, and it's one that I absolutely, completely did not predict and would not have predicted, and that's immigration. If you look at public attitudes, if you look at both the salience of immigration as a political issue, it has dropped extremely sharply since the referendum. People are much less worried in general about immigration than they were at the time of the referendum, when it was actually the most important issue, apart from Europe and Brexit. It was the most important single issue. Now it's scraping along the bottom of the Mori Issues Index, well below climate change, transport and crime, let alone the economy or the NHS. So immigration has become much less of a salient political issue, but public opinion has also radically changed for the better. The proportion of Brits who think that immigration has by and large been a good thing for this country, both from an economic and a broader cultural and social perspective, 4 years ago was roughly 60-40 in the negative. That has reversed. It's now roughly 60-40 in the positive. And there are a whole bunch of polls. This is not just one survey. A whole bunch of measures of public opinion which confirm this. So there has been a pretty significant, long-lasting shift in what the public think about immigration. And that really matters for what is politically feasible. Now, why has that happened? We don't know. Is it because people think that Brexit has some, there are different competing explanations. One is that people think that Brexit has somehow sorted the immigration issue and you don't have to worry about it anymore, even though, as I said before, nothing has actually changed. Another is that Brexit, and in particular the sharp fall in European migration that I showed earlier, has made people realize that there are actually trade-offs. You can't just say, I'd rather have lots fewer immigrants, but of course I still want the ones who work, on the in the National Health Service or in the universities. There are trade-offs. It's part of a package, and if you do things which discourage immigrants from coming to your country, you will find that you have fewer nurses in your hospitals and so on, and that's certainly something that I think people have begun to notice. So it could be that. One paper which I was just reading on the plane on the way up actually suggests that a slightly more nuanced view is that Brexit has led to a reaction against xenophobia and racism, that Brexit brought out some nasty things and some nasty people from the corners of the closet, as it were. But actually, most people, whether they voted Remain or Leave, do not particularly want to be associated with those still relatively fringe views, and therefore have shifted their views on immigration more generally in a more liberal direction. Whether that's a convincing hypothesis or not, I'm not sure. But whatever and then there's finally a fourth one, which is the media cover, and related to the first three, I think, but slightly separate. The media coverage of immigration has changed quite a lot. It's not that the Sun and the Mail have suddenly become hugely pro-immigration, but the number of really the volume and nastiness of really anti-immigration coverage has really reduced very, very significantly. That's a very noticeable change in the British press. So all of this opens up, I think, a window of opportunity and for a more liberal immigration policy, a window which has been further opened by the departure of Theresa May. And whatever you think of the relative merits of Theresa May and Boris Johnson on other aspects, including Brexit, there is absolutely no doubt that Theresa May was by far the most anti-immigration prime minister in living memory. And Boris Johnson, whatever his views, is not ideologically particularly anti-immigration. And a number of the people on his wing of the Brexit wing of the party are indeed relatively liberal. So I think that the policy space has opened up. The policy direction opens up, and in particular, the at least lip service to a points-based system opens up in particular opportunities for Scotland and for the Scottish government. Opportunities in the context of Brexit and beyond. So as I say, I think for the first time there is perhaps some cause to be, first time in a number of years, there is perhaps some cause for optimism, and I do hope that the Scottish politicians and Scottish civil society will take advantage of those opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, we have a good chunk of time for questions. We'll follow our normal practice of taking them in bunches of 2 or 3. So first one here.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's very interesting. One thing you didn't touch on was the enforcement of immigration policy. I mean, employers have to basically check the status of a visa and see whether people can work here or not. And if that visa said only available to work in Scotland, why wouldn't that just work? Why would the immigration authorities find that so difficult to cope with?
And we have 2 questions in a more or less conveniently straight line behind you. So
we're supposed to be on the verge of doing free trade deals with most of the rest of the world. Is that likely to have a significant impact that our immigration policy will be up for grabs in these negotiations?
More of a comment than anything, really. But so you compared Scotland with Wales and sort of parts of the North East. I would take slight concern at that because those areas politically made their feelings known towards migration. So I find it somewhat problematic comparing Scotland to those regions who were quite clear on their views on migration. Scotland was quite clear on our views on migration. So I understand what you're saying about, having regional systems, but I don't think it's very compatible in my opinion.
Okay, so I mean, the first question, I mean, I think the short answer is yes, you're right. One does frequently, when you talk about regional differentiation for immigration systems, the first reaction from a lot of people is, but that would mean border controls at Hadrian's Wall or whatever, or around the M25 if you did it for London. And that's not right. That's not how we control immigration for work purposes now. We control it primarily through the work permit system. So you're right, we could do it. It's not, it isn't quite as easy as that. Because companies have registered address. You have a place of work. You have a company's registered address. Everybody who when I worked at DWP, I think everybody who worked for DWP was registered in Newcastle. Their national insurance number was tied to address in Newcastle rather than in London, and so on. So you would need some new, and of course, you have to deal with changes of circumstances. So if you come to work for a bank and the bank decides to transfer you from Edinburgh to London, do you have to requalify? So there are a bunch of complications. But your basic point is that this is not something that's administratively infeasible, and that indeed other countries do it that way, like Australia and Canada, is correct. So I would agree with that. The second question was about free trade deals. I think I distinguish. I think there are three categories. Category one is our deal with the EU. What provisions will there be on labor mobility and that in that? I think it's pretty clear free movement isn't going to be part of the discussions under this government. It might be under another government which wanted to keep us either de facto or de jure into the single market. It would very much be part of the discussions. If it is, however, this government or one pursuing a similar policy, then I think there will be there'll be quite a lot of detailed work on business visits, on transfers between companies, on things like that, but relatively little on immigration policy, and that's been the case in previous EU talks with third countries. The Canada CETA, the Canada EU trade deal, has some provisions on very limited provisions on labor mobility, which in practice don't appear to have been taken up by almost anyone, as far as we can tell from the data. So I would guess that under the Johnson model of a relatively hard Brexit and just a free trade deal, we're not going to get very much in the EU. But that would change if we had a government that wanted to have a relationship much more like the one Theresa May or even Jeremy Corbyn claimed to want. A second category is free trade deals with almost everyone else, like the US or China. Those basically will have almost nothing on labor mobility in them. Labor mobility is just not really part of most trade deals, and immigration just isn't part of most trade deals, and hasn't been, and I don't think that's going to change. Then the third category, which is the exception to the second category, is India, where the Indians have made absolutely clear that quite significant provisions on skilled work visas and intercompany transfers and probably student visas, are a precondition for talking about a trade deal. And that is because of both the reason India is different. It's a mix of historical reasons, of cultural reasons, and the fact that a large proportion of the Indian elite actually value the mobility, both for themselves and their children, higher than the elites of to the UK, higher than elites of most other countries, but also economics, because Indians use quite a lot of the skilled work visas that are currently given, particularly for intercompany transfers for IT work, and that's a very big set of big and influential set of Indian businesses and a big component of Indian exports. So it is entirely in their rational economic interest to make that an important ask. I think both for that reason, but also for a bunch of other reasons, an India-UK trade deal is going to be a long and complicated and painful thing to negotiate. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight, although again, it may be considerably more likely under Johnson and Patel than it would have been under Theresa May, where I think it would have been a complete non-starter for those reasons. Your final point, clearly you're right. The political context for immigration policy here is quite different from is in other parts. Although I think there has been perhaps some shift in Wales since the referendum, as I previously described. But it's true that Scotland is something of an outlier here. But there is, I think, a broader political economy motivation for saying that if you're going to do it for Scotland, you might as well do it for other regions as well, which is to let those regions take ownership of their own choices, right? The IPPR in their paper on geographical differentiation made this case and essentially saying, well, look, if the Northeast really, really wants a much more restrictive immigration policy than either London or Scotland, and that's their democratic choice, let them have it and let them live with the economic consequences. And maybe after 5 or 10 years, they'll realize that this is not necessarily an optimal course of action and there are some pretty big downsides as well.
Thanks. Let's give the other side of the room a chance. There's one here.
As a layperson, I've often wondered whether people like you are knocking on the doors of government departments to try and make them aware of your findings and your conclusions, or is it the other way around? Do they come to you with policy and say, you figure out how we can implement it?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I just wonder, I'm going to just shift this slightly on its head and say that actually neither a point-based system nor an employer-led system has actually resolved, or potentially would resolve, the current problem that we cannot get the skill set we need within industries at present. So actually, what are your views on that?
Okay, first question. Well, I'm afraid the Home Office, some departments do come and talk to you about policy. The Home Office is not one, and never has been. I'm like John, I was a civil servant, and I think in DWP we were certainly a long way from being perfect in our engagement with academics and research, but we did try, and we did make an effort, and we did get people in and go out. I think in the Home Office is really a bit of a lost cause. By contrast, however, the Migration Advisory Committee is relatively open. It is independent external academic experts, and they do also commission research. And I've done, in their September report, they commissioned research from me and from 4 or 5 other academics. So there is, in that sense, there is at least some analytical input into at least the economic analysis, not that much into actually the policy, I would say, and that I'm afraid is a particularly has always been a particular issue with the Home Office. I think in general, this government has been less interested in analysis and evidence than across the board than previous ones. Although there have been some bright spots in parts of the education agenda, they haven't been bad actually. Again, largely by sort of contracting out to independent advisory bodies like the MAC. In the case of the education, the Early Intervention Foundation has a bunch of money to do various things, and that's been quite useful. So it's not all bad. But I would not say overall that it's great. Second question was about non-economic migration. I mean, I think there are a bunch of things going in, all sorts of different directions here. So the Windrush scandal has, I think, shown something of a light on just how dreadful the Home Office treatment of people in, and generally far worse for non-economic migrants, has been, and that is, belatedly driving a bit of rethinking in the Home Office. What will that, will that actually lead to meaningful change? I'm not sure. And there has been a little bit of grudging liberalization on some policies, like immigration detention and so on. Partly, I think, driven again by this sort of post-Windrush backlash. So on things like asylum seekers' right to work, there seems to be a bit more movement or potential for movement in the Home Office than there has been, and so on. So I think there are a few chinks of light, and equally on all of these issues, Labour has become much, much more liberal than it was in the Blair years. So that ground has shifted a bit. On the other hand, there is the very immediate, or not very immediate, but sort of not that far away risk that results from the settled status scheme. We are in the process of trying to register 3.5 million people who currently have the right to live here and to access almost all services purely on the basis of the fact that they're European and they're therefore essentially treated more or less as if they were British. In order to preserve most of those rights, they're going to have to register. 3.5 million people are not going to register.
Can I just stop you there, because they have to apply. They don't register automatically. It's an application.
Yes.
So that's really important to keep that in mind. Because it's not just an
No, right. They have to apply and demonstrate various things. Now, the process for doing that is far simpler, cheaper, and less burdensome than any previous immigration system we've ever had in this country, which is a good thing, obviously. But the fact remains that if you try to process 3.5 million people, you're not going. I doubt that any previous Home Office process has had an error rate of less than 20 to 40%. If this one manages to, by being quicker, more efficient, less rigorous in terms of what it's asking, manages to get the number of false negatives down to 1 to 5%, that would be a superhuman achievement, and one that many of us would not think that the Home Office was remotely capable of. But we're still talking about well north of 100,000 people who find themselves without a status at the end of the transition period. That's a lot of people. That is probably 50 times as many people as were caught up in the Windrush thing. So, that's not small. And obviously, the people who do not register, who do not apply, or mistakenly get denied and don't know how to cope, are going to be disproportionately the vulnerable, those with disabilities, physical or mental, children in care, homeless people, all the rest of it, for all the obvious reasons. So we've got a potentially really, really big problem. And my view is that in the end, the Home Office, the government will have to recognize this by essentially allowing a sort of quasi amnesty. But we're not there yet, because I think the alternatives are too unpleasant. But we're not there yet. So that's one further big set of issues. The final point about we still have skill or big skill shortages in Scotland in particular, even under a new system. I'm not sure that need be the case. If you have a system that is more liberal and better attuned does have some elements of flexibility for Scotland. When Scotland had its version of the post-study work route for people graduating from Scottish universities staying on, that actually I forgot the name of that program, but it had a particular name. Fresh Talent, exactly. The evaluation suggested that had actually been relatively successful, and I think if Scotland actually, if there is a new, relatively more liberal system, and Scotland takes advantage, Scotland and Scotland businesses and universities take advantage of that by marketing it, by saying, "Look, come here. You can come here and study. You can stay on." There are lots of people in the world who do want to come and live in a relatively advanced, developed economy where there are jobs and opportunities. I mean, certainly not everyone wants to come and live in Scotland, but there are enough people out there who would if they had the opportunity. So I don't think that is an insuperable obstacle.
So it relates to that question. Would the very fact of independence change that desirability of Scotland as a place to live or work? Or would it depend on what the policies of that independent Scotland were?
And just two more questions down at the front. One there and then one here.
These schemes, of course, focus on the economically active migrant. Do you see any changes in family migration and in the movement of economically inactive people, such as pensioners, in the near future?
It's talking about working between departments, like immigration and the department in charge of labor. Like, we have a huge pool of people in this country who haven't been channeled into, work, or they can't get work, not because they don't want to work, but because there's a lot of competition, and our young people are not even getting, jobs which are of low skills, and we've got university graduates who can't get jobs. We need to address these people to help them. Like the universal credit, it's not just a case of meeting them and say, okay, you get £50 a week. It should be a case of like, right, okay, you have a degree, your degree is a general degree, and maybe you don't have the skills for particular jobs, but if we can channel you, and get our human resource in this country moving to the right jobs, and these will affect, the immigration figures. We will know, how many people in this country can be channeled to jobs, whether they are graduates or non-graduates, right? And then it will influence the figures of immigration, right? It's got to be a really, really well-planned government, planning for all these. It's like we have curriculum of excellence in schools because we want different subjects to interrelate, to connect, right? So a very progressive country will need to have all this working in very close cooperation. So could you enlighten me as to what the country is doing about all this human resource that are lying idle, sitting at home, like my own son is sitting at home. He has been turned down for a number of jobs. He's a graduate, right? So I am just burdened for all these people in our country who would like to work,
So,
independence. I think the answer is it does mostly depend on what post-independence policies Scotland pursued, and how that impacted on, basically if Scotland's economically dynamic and prosperous after, if it appears that Scotland is doing well economically, there shouldn't be any problem in attracting migrants. If it's perceived as being insular and declining, it'll be much harder. Related to that, I think, though, is EU membership actually will be a really big deal. If Scotland is again de facto or de jure effectively an EU member, and the rest of the country is not, then it actually will have a pretty big comparative advantage in attracting skilled migrants that it doesn't have now. If it's not an EU member and it's actually no longer part of the UK nor of the EU, then unless it has some other attractions, then I think it becomes much harder. The second question about migration of economically inactive people. I mean, at the moment, it's pretty difficult to come here as a pensioner, unless you're European or you're British, and I don't think that's going to change under the policies of this government. The Labour have signalled they might be somewhat more liberal on this, and I think they probably would be somewhat more liberal on this. But it's not. I don't think it's going to be a priority, certainly for this government, to loosen the restrictions on economically inactive people. Finally, on this. I'm not sure I agree with you on either of the main points there. I mean, the first main point, the interaction between immigration and the labour market, we have, for better or worse, whatever you may think about other developments in the labour market, there are more people in work in the UK than in recorded economic history by quite a long way, and a higher proportion of people of working age are in work than in recorded economic history, and that's after 20 years of by historical standards, very high levels of immigration. So this sort of trade-off between immigrants taking the jobs and Brits taking the jobs is conspicuously absent from what's actually happened in the UK, both over the last 20 years and particularly over the last 5 years, again, when we've had growing employment, higher employment rates, lower employment, lower unemployment than since we started collecting statistics. At the same time as we've had pretty high levels very high levels of immigration recorded in 2016, again by historical standards. So that doesn't mean that immigration doesn't affect the labour market. Clearly, it does, but it does so in a much more complicated way. And that brings on to the sort of second question, which is this idea that we need coordination and planning. I'm really, really skeptical of that. Having been the chief economist at DWP and having had a lot to do also with the Home Office, the idea that we can plan the British labour market from Whitehall, it's a fantasy. Whitehall officials, Westminster and Whitehall, do not and should not have the capacity to try and plan. We cannot say how many thousand, forklift truck operators or Python programmers the country needs in 5 years. That is not something that civil servants can do. It's not something that any one individual private sector business can do either. It's something that emerges as part of a healthy market economy. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to do about ensuring that people have skills that are useful, marketable, that enable them to have fulfilling careers at all levels of the labour market, and that is something that we have failed large proportions of our society in over the last, I'd say, 50 years. But I am a bit skeptical about some of the sort of argument. We're producing all these people with degrees and they can't get jobs and they all have useless degrees, and in aggregate, that's just not true. The graduate earnings, despite the fact that compared to when I went to university, we have, I think, 4 times as many university graduates as we did then as a proportion of the population. But the graduate earnings premium, the difference in earnings between people who have a degree, despite this huge increase in relative supply of graduates, there hasn't been a fall in the relative wages of graduates. The graduate earnings premium, the extra money you get by being a graduate, is as high, is pretty much the same as it was then, which suggests that the demand for graduates is still very high. That doesn't mean that there aren't some useless courses, or that there aren't some people who would have been better off if they had been doing something else. But in aggregate, it's quite hard to make that argument. And again, when I was when I went to university, people used to make jokes about media studies. That was the epitome of a joke degree when I was 20 or 25. All these people doing media studies, what on earth were they going to do with that? But of course, in the broader sense, creative in media has grown probably 10 times as fast as the rest of the British economy, and mostly in relatively high-value, high-skilled jobs over the last 20 years. So, that on balance, that doesn't appear to have worked out too badly for us. So, as I say, there was a lot we've done wrong, and there's a lot more we need to do, particularly for the 50% of kids who still don't go to higher education. But I am quite skeptical of the idea that we can somehow magically plan everything.
Oh, sudden burst of questions. We better take all four together. So 3 at the back over there and 1 down here, because I suspect this is our last round.
If there's no central planning at all on the points-based system, who's going to set the points and for what?
My question's directed around the kind of tech and digital skills gap that we have in Scotland. So at the moment, I think we have around a gap of about 13,000 a year. And which kind of system do you think would best help plug that gap if we were looking to help bring in immigration to help plug that gap? And also whether or not we should use immigration or upskilled workers to fill our digital skills gap?
Thanks. Just a factual question, if I understood one of the graphs. Was it saying that only about 15% of EU immigrants in Scotland were earning 30,000 or above? It seemed quite low. And the South East, even London South East, it was 60-70%. The UK average salary is, 26, 28, depending how you slice it. That means most immigrants in the UK are earning below the national average. I don't think had I read that graph correctly?
And the last one just down here.
Just on employment figures. Unemployment figures, I'm a city veteran councillor, and I am terrified about people working in the gig economy. For example, there are thousands of people in Edinburgh technically employed and are driving Uber taxis. Now, does the Home Office really believe the figures? Because, yeah, they're employed, but are they employed usefully, gainfully? Are they looking after themselves? And how much is the state subsidising these companies who are paying little or no taxes in this country, but we're subsidising their workers to stay alive because they don't pay proper wages?
Okay. The first question about planning in a points-based system, that's a really good question, and that's a sort of fundamental tension. Particularly, I mean, it's true of all immigration systems to some extent because, as I said, if you don't have open borders or closed borders, you have to have some criteria set by the state. But it is particularly true of points-based system. And I think that the Australians, for example, did have at one point, a very, very detailed list of shortage occupations. You know, we need, and we do to some extent actually under the current system. I think the Migration Advisory Committee does actually occasionally look at and decide whether sheep shearers are a shortage occupation and ballet dancers. I'm serious. Both of those are examples which committee members have pointed out to me because they have very particular circumstances. So that is a tension. And I think for that reason, because it's quite difficult, and it turns out that bureaucrats often get it wrong, and you decide you need some of this, and then 2 years later, when they've actually arrived, you don't need them, and the market actually needs someone else. Have tended to go on for broader brush categories. So you say, well, if you've got a master's degree in science or engineering or mathematics, broadly defined. Well, we don't know precisely what sector you might work in or what exactly you're going to be doing, but you're probably, from the human capital point of view, a reasonably good bet. So I think that's how you try to square that circle, but it is a circle to be squared. There is a tension there. I think that's absolutely right. Second question, which I think relates to that, about the digital skills gap. I mean, I think digital is an area that's, I think, and this is true in London as well as Scotland, of particular concern, because a lot of the firms that you think you might want to encourage are relatively small, relatively new. They may not have big HR departments. So obviously, PwC and Google can A, pay above the salary threshold, but B, and perhaps more importantly, will have an HR department who knows how to deal with the Home Office and fill in the forms correctly, whereas your average digital startup may well not pay enough, and even if it did, he's probably not going to devote the time and resources to getting somebody in. And I think in that respect, that's why something like the fresh talent stroke post-study work route is, if you don't have free movement, then having something like that is particularly helpful. If you can automatically say to students, well, you've been here 3 years, you've got your degree, we'll let you stay on for a couple of years. We don't care that much what you do or how much you earn. After that, we'll see how you're doing, and then decide whether if you want to stay on, whether or not you meet the criteria. That, it seems to me, that sort of flexible approach is what you want for that sort of sector. As to whether we should have more immigration or upskill people, I think, especially for growing sectors, it's really not a choice. It's not an either or. To the extent the growth of your sector is constrained by the availability of people who can and want to work in it, then your sector will grow more if you have more immigration, and it will grow more if you can upskill more people locally, and if you can do both, it will grow even more. And I don't think that there is, there may be a bit of a trade-off in the margin as to where you focus your efforts, but not much. Uber and the gig economy. I think there clearly are a bunch of issues here relating to, I think, primarily to the fact that we have employment law that just wasn't designed for the forms of employment we currently have, and for where the labor market has gone. Employment law hasn't much changed since I was in DWP, when Uber and these and similar business models just didn't exist, and we need to work out. It's tough because I think lots of people do want to work flexibly. You can't put that, and even if you wanted to, you can't put that genie completely back into the bottle. On the other hand, the idea that Uber doesn't actually employ anybody, I think, is a transparent legal fiction which really should not be allowed to continue. So how do you resolve that contradiction? We're quite a ways away from doing that. I know. I mean, and to be fair, the government has, government and other parties have started thinking about this, but we're a long way from where we ought to be on that. There was one more, sorry, which
the average earnings of EU migrants, yes, and how that relates to the forecasts.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I think I'd have to look again at the graph at the MAC report to work out what the base was, because of course you're right, 26 to 28,000 is the average salary of a full-time employee of a worker who is in full-time employment, but lots of people are not in full-time employment. They may not be employed at all, and they may not be employed. So if you did this figure for the British population, you wouldn't get it wouldn't necessarily be. It would probably be higher, but not that much higher. But it is true. But lots of Brits and lots of EU migrants aren't in full-time employment. But it is true that on average, EEA workers have lower salaries than the UK average, particularly those from the either the, and again there's some heterogeneity there. People from the EU 14, the old EU countries, have on average higher wages than Brits. People from the A8, the countries that joined in 2004, have lower wages, and people from the Romania and Bulgaria have even lower wages.
Okay, well, it's my sense is we could go on, and my regret is that I've had to restrain myself from asking any of the questions that I wanted to ask. But no, because we promised people an opportunity to mingle and talk to each other at these events. So it's my pleasant duty, Jonathan, to thank you on behalf of everyone. The volume and the urgency of the questions is always a bit of a clue to how valuable people have found one of these events, and clearly people have been stimulated enormously by what you had to say. I was also reflecting on the fact that at some events of this kind, at places other than the David Hume Institute, when people are asked questions, all they do is repeat what they've already told you. Others give you a glimpse of the fact that they could have given you a whole other presentation on the subject of the questions, and we've very definitely had a series of glimpses of that kind from your answers to the questions.
Well, I'd also say, on the other side, lots of these events, the audiences ask questions which are actually speeches or presentations of point of view, and I think all of the questions, including even the question from the person who described it as a comment, were interesting, relevant, and sensible, useful questions, which are well worth asking and trying to answer.
Well, we're grateful for the mutual congratulation, but I think you're the one who deserves the applause, Jonathan. And before we unleash you to the back of the room, can I just remind you that that very shortly we have another event following through the theme of Scotland's demographics and patterns of migration from Professor Michael Anderson and jointly with Graham Roy, the director of the Fraser of Allender Institute. Mike Anderson tells me that when he presented his recent book at this subject at the book festival this year, the entire big tent sold out in less than a day. So we're going to give you the same opportunity with absolutely no charge. So how can you possibly resist that? 26th of November. So that's our next date for your diary to continue what we hope will be a conversation within our group of supporters about this vital subject for Scotland's economic future. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the evening.